The arrow was already nocked when the orc scout stepped out from behind the granite shelf, and Abel Brooks felt his whole body go cold with the certainty that someone was about to die. "Loose on my mark," Sergeant Deacon Price hissed, and 6 bowstrings creaked in the frost-thin air of the ridge above Grayridge Camp. 6 recruits, barely trained, barely blooded, all with their arrows trembling toward a single orc woman who stood alone on the scree with a curved blade already drawn. She was tall enough that she did not need to look up at any of them, and even pinned between 6 points of iron she did not flinch. Her skin was a deep mossy green touched with gray at the throat, scarred faintly along one cheekbone, and her dark hair was pulled back in 2 thick braids threaded with beads of pale bone that clicked faintly when she turned her head. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark hide cinched tight at her narrow waist with bands of tarnished bronze, a sleeveless leather vest laced snug over a dark undershirt that clung to broad, strong shoulders, and knee-high boots scuffed from miles of mountain travel. She looked less like prey and more like something that had simply chosen for the moment to stand still. "She's alone," Abel said. His voice did not carry the way Price's did, but it cut through the ragged breathing of the other recruits all the same. "Look at her leg." Nobody looked at her leg. Everybody kept their arrows trained on her chest. "Loose," Price said again, sharper. Abel Brooks lowered his bow. He did it without thinking about the consequence of it, the way he might reach out a hand to calm a spooked colt before he decided to do it at all. His arm simply would not lift the weapon toward a woman who was bleeding from a gash along her thigh, standing on a leg that could barely hold her weight, facing down 6 armed men with nothing but a blade and a jaw set hard enough to crack stone. "Brooks," Price snapped, "aim your bow." "She's wounded and outnumbered 6 to 1, Abel said. "That's not a fight, Sergeant, that's an execution. She's an orc scout on camp land, which makes it a border violation and makes her our problem to end," Price said. "Aim your bow or I'll have you up on charges." Around him, the other 5 recruits held their aim, sweat beading despite the cold, arms shaking with strain and fear in equal measure. Abel could see it in their eyes. None of them wanted to be the one to loose first, and none of them wanted to be the one who didn't. He understood that fear. He had felt it plenty of times in his life, the fear of being the one who stood apart. He had felt it every day since he'd been dragged up from the stables to stand watch duty because Grayridge Camp was short of able bodies, and the timber convoys kept getting harassed along the eastern switchbacks. He was no soldier. He broke horses for a living, gentled the wild ones that came up from the lowland traders too spooked to pull a wagon, and he had a way of making frightened things believe, for just long enough, that the hand reaching for them meant no harm. It was the only thing he had ever been good at. He looked at the orc woman's leg again, at the blood soaking dark through the leather at her thigh, and he thought, "She is afraid, too, even if she does not look it." "I won't," Abel said. The words came out steadier than he felt. Beside him, young Tomlin Reese made a small strangled sound of disbelief. Price's face went the color of a bruise. "You'll lower that bow and put an arrow in her, Brooks, or I will report you as a coward and a traitor to Overseer Hale before the sun sets." "Report me, then." Abel set the bow down against his shoulder, the string slack, the arrow still nocked but pointed at the dirt. "I'm not killing a wounded woman standing still. If she charges, if she raises that blade against one of us, that's different. But she hasn't. She's just standing there." The orc scout's dark eyes, which had been flicking rapidly between the 6 bows leveled at her, settled on Abel Brooks. Something in her expression shifted, not softness, not yet, but a kind of sharp, startled attention, the way a creature reacts when it expects a trap to spring and instead finds the jaws simply will not close. "Human," she said, and her voice was low and rough, carrying easily across the space between them despite how quiet it was. "You would let your own men call you coward for me." "I'm not doing it for you," Abel said, though even as the words left him he was not entirely sure that was true. "I'm doing it because I won't put an arrow in someone who hasn't raised a hand against me." She studied him a long moment. Blood ran steadily down her leg and dripped into the gray scree, and still she held her blade high, Still, she held herself like a woman who intended to take at least 2 of them down with her before she fell. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered it. Not far, not fully, but enough that the curved edge no longer pointed at any man's throat, enough that Price's whole company let out a breath they had not known they were holding. "She's surrendering," Tomlin Reese said, disbelieving. "Sergeant, she's surrendering." "She's tricking us," Price snarled, but even he did not loose his arrow because the moment had shifted, the way a held breath shifts when the danger has passed, and 6 armed recruits and 1 wounded Orc scout stood on a mountain ridge in a silence that felt, for the first time, almost survivable. "I yield," the Orc woman said, and there was no shame in the words, only a flat and weary practicality. "I am alone. My leg is broken in its use. I would rather live to see my clan again than die proving a point on this rock." Her eyes did not leave Abel's face. "You, archer who would not aim, what is your name?" "Abel Brooks," he said. "Bagrak Bloodhorn," she answered, as though the exchange of names settled something between them, some old and unspoken law of the wilds that said a name given was a debt owed. "Remember it. I do not forget the men who choose not to be executioners." Price ordered her bound at spearpoint, hands lashed with rawhide cord, her blade confiscated, and her wounded leg wrapped tight enough to slow the bleeding but not so gently that she was spared any pain in the process. He wanted to march her straight back to camp as a trophy, proof that Grairidge's watch had teeth after all, and in this at least Abel could not argue, because a captured scout meant intelligence about her clan's movements, and intelligence meant fewer ambushes on the timber road, fewer men buried under cairns of stacked river stone. But it was Abel who carried the litter they rigged from 2 spear hafts and a canvas tarp when Bagrak's leg gave out entirely on the descent. Abel who told the others to slow their pace, so the jostling would not tear the wound wider. Abel who, when they finally staggered through the gates of Grairidge camp as dusk purpled the peaks above them, found himself the object of 100 curious and hostile stares, and one long, unreadable look from the Orc woman he had refused to kill. Grairidge camp was not a town so much as a wound cut into the mountain and stitched shut with timber and stone. It clung to the side of a steep valley in the Thornwood Range, a sprawl of log longhouses and canvas-roofed sheds built around the black mouths of the silver mines, and the endless stacks of felled timber waiting to be hauled down to the lowland markets. Smoke from a dozen chimneys hung low over the rooftops most evenings, and the ring of axes and picks never fully stopped, even after dark, when the night crews took their turns in the deep shafts. It was a hard place, full of hard men and harder women, most of them drawn there by debt or desperation, or the simple fact that there was nowhere softer left for them to go. The Thornwood Accord, an old truce struck 2 generations back between the border settlements and the Orc clans of the high passes, was the only thing that kept outright war from swallowing the valley whole, and even that truce was a threadbare thing, tested every season by raiders on both sides who had never learned to see each other as anything but enemies. Abel had come to Grairidge 4 years ago with nothing but a bad debt of his father's hanging over his name, and a gift for gentling horses that no one back home had ever thought to value. He kept to the stables at the camp's western edge, breaking the pack mules and draft horses that came up the mountain roads too wild and too frightened to be of any use, and in 4 years he had made exactly one friend, an old muleteer named Fenwick who talked more to his animals than to people, and had otherwise remained precisely what he had always been, overlooked, unremarkable, easy to forget in a room. He had never minded it, not really. He had simply never expected anything else. They put Bagrak Bloodhorn in the old stone grain shed behind Abel's own stables, the only structure in camp with a door thick enough and a lock strong enough to hold a prisoner. And because Abel was the one who tended that end of camp, because he was the one already down there mucking stalls and mixing feed every dawn and dusk, Overseer Corwin Hale decided, with the particular carelessness of a man assigning an unpleasant duty to whoever was already nearby. That Abel would be the one to see to her wound and bring her food until the council decided what was to be done with her. "You're already down there," Hale said, not looking up from his ledgers. "Might as well be useful twice over." So it was that on the second night, Abel found himself crouched in the straw-strewn dark of the grain shed with a lantern in one hand and a bowl of broth in the other, facing the very woman he had refused to put an arrow through. She sat propped against the stone wall, her wounded leg stretched stiffly in front of her, freshly bound in a cleaner wrap than Price's men had bothered to give her. Someone, likely the camp's aging healer, old Marta, had at least tended the wound properly, though the orc woman's wrists were still lashed with rawhide, chafed raw at the edges. Her dark eyes tracked him the moment he stepped through the door, sharp and assessing, and something in the set of her jaw told him she had spent the day deciding exactly what she thought of him and had not yet finished deciding. "You again," she said. "Me again." He set the lantern on an overturned crate and held out the bowl. "Brought you something to eat. It's not much. Barley and salt pork, better than nothing." She did not reach for it. Her bound hand sat still in her lap. "Your hands are shaking, horse boy." He hadn't realized they were. He set the bowl down carefully on the straw within her reach instead of forcing her to take it from his hand, an instinct born of 4 years spent approaching frightened animals slowly, sideways, never head-on. "I've never fed a prisoner before," he admitted. "Didn't know the etiquette." Something that might almost have been amusement flickered across her scarred face. "There is no etiquette. There is only whether the food is poisoned. It's not poisoned. You would say that either way." "I would," he agreed. "But it isn't." She studied him a long moment, then leaned forward awkwardly, hampered by her bound wrists and her stiff leg, and picked up the bowl. She ate without grace, tearing chunks of pork with her teeth, but she ate all of it, and when she was done she set the bowl down and looked at him with an expression he could not name. "Why did you not aim your bow, Abel Brooks?" He considered lying, giving her some noble answer about honor or mercy. Instead he told her the truth because it was easier, and because something about her flat, dark eyes made him think lying would only earn her contempt. "I work with horses." You learn real quick that a frightened thing backed into a corner isn't dangerous because it's cruel. It's dangerous because it's scared and has no other choice left. "You didn't look cruel to me. You looked cornered." "I was not afraid," she said too quickly. "I didn't say you were a coward. I said you were cornered. Those aren't the same thing." He settled back on his heels, elbows on his knees. 6 bows on 1 wounded woman isn't a fair fight. I wasn't going to be part of it." Bagrak Bloodhorn was quiet for a long moment, and in the lantern light he saw something shift behind her eyes, some old and heavy weight settling differently than before. "Among my clan," she said finally, "there is no honor in killing what cannot fight back. My mother taught me this before she died at the hands of your people's border raiders. It seems strange to hear a human say the same." "Maybe it's not just your people who believe it," Abel said. "Maybe it's just easier to forget on both sides when there's a war on." "Is there a war on?" "There's supposed to be a truce. Some days it's hard to tell the difference." He rose, brushing straw from his knees. "I'll bring more broth in the morning, and I'll see about getting Marta to look at that wrist. The rope's cutting you." He was almost to the door when her voice stopped him. "Abel Brooks." He turned. "Thank you," she said, the words clearly costing her something, clearly unfamiliar in her mouth when spoken to a human. "For the bow you did not raise." He didn't know what to say to that, so he only nodded and left her in the dark with the lantern's glow fading behind him, and did not sleep well that night, turning over and over the memory of her lowering her blade, the way something in his chest had loosened when she did. The camp council met 3 days later in the long timber hall at the center of Greyridge, and Abel, though he had no standing to be there, went anyway, standing at the back near the door with his hat in his hands while Overseer Hale, Magistrate Ellery Finch, and Sergeant Price argued over the fate of the orc woman chained in the grain shed. "She's a scout, which means she was mapping our timber routes for a raid," Price insisted, pacing before the long hearth. Every day we keep her alive is a day her clan wonders where she's gone, and a day closer to them coming looking. We hang her at dawn and send the body back over the ridge as a warning. And break the thornwood accord in the process, Magistrate Finch said tiredly. She was a narrow, silver-haired woman who had signed enough treaty renewals in her years at Greyridge to have grown allergic to bloodshed for its own sake. The accord states clearly that any orc taken captive on contested land who yields without bloodshed is to be held for ransom, exchange, or, she paused, glancing toward the back of the room, claimed. Claimed, Hale repeated, with the flat disgust of a man who found the entire old custom faintly obscene. Nobody's invoked a claiming in this valley in 30 years, Ellery. That doesn't make the clause any less binding, Finch said. The accord allows that an orc captive who has yielded may be bound by mutual claim to a human of standing within the camp, a marriage bond recognized by both human and clan law, and thereby granted protection as kin, rather than executed as a spoil of war. It was written to prevent exactly this sort of slaughter. If she can find someone in this camp willing to make that claim, and she consents to it, we are bound by treaty to honor it. Her clan will be bound to honor it too, or risk breaking the accord themselves. And who in the 9 hells is going to marry an orc scout to save her neck? Price demanded, half laughing at the absurdity of it. Abel Brooks from the back of the hall said, "I will." The room went silent. He had not planned to say it. The words had simply risen up out of him the way his lowered bow had risen up out of him on the ridge, some current beneath his thinking that moved faster than his fear could catch it. Every face in the hall turned toward him, Hale's disbelieving, Price's contemptuous, Finch's sharp and assessing. "You," Price said. "The stable boy." "I've got a name," Abel said, though his voice was not entirely steady. "It's Abel Brooks. I'm the one who tends her wound. I'm of age, I've no wife, no debts I can't cover, and if the law says a claim can be made, I'm willing to make it if she's willing to accept it." "This is madness," Hale said. "You'd bind yourself to an orc to save her from the noose out of what pity?" "Out of not wanting to see someone hanged who yielded and didn't have to," Abel said. "I don't know if that's pity or not. I know it's the only thing I can think to offer." Magistrate Finch studied him for a long moment, then said, quietly, "The law requires her consent as much as yours, Abel Brooks. Fetch her here. Let her speak for herself." They brought Bagrak Bloodhorn to the hall under guard, her wrists still bound, her leg healed enough now to bear weight with only a slight limp. She walked into the firelight with her chin high, and when her eyes found Abel standing at the back of the room, something passed between them that the rest of the hall could not have named, but everyone in it seemed to feel regardless. A kind of charge in the air like the moment before a mountain storm breaks. Finch explained the clause to her plainly without softening it, the treaty right of claiming, the binding of clan and camp law alike, the fact that it would make her, in the eyes of both peoples, wife to the man who claimed her, protected under his name as surely as she would have been protected under her clan's banner. Bagrak listened without expression. Then she looked at Abel for a long moment. "You would do this," she said, "for a stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," Abel said. "You told me your name on that ridge. Said you don't forget men who won't be executioners. Figure I ought to return the favor and not forget the woman who lowered her blade first." A murmur ran through the hall at that, low and startled at the reminder of what had happened on the ridge, at the plain fact spoken aloud now for the first time that it had been her mercy meeting his. "If I accept this claim," Bagrak said slowly, "I am bound to you under your law, and you are bound to me under mine. It is not a small thing, human. Among my people, a claim accepted is not undone lightly. It is not a shield you may set down when it grows heavy." "I'm not looking to set it down," Abel said. "I'm looking to keep you from hanging at dawn." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close to one, sharp and startled and real. Bold words from a man who has never shared a bed nor a fire with the woman he claims. Heat rose up the back of Abel's neck as several of the watching camp folk laughed, low and uneasy. "I reckon we'd have time to work out the particulars." Bagrak Bloodhorn looked at him for a long, considering moment, the firelight catching the bone beads in her braids, and then she said, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, "Then I accept this claim, Abel Brooks. I will be bound to you, as you are bound to me, under the old law, and any who challenge it challenge me as well as you." It was Magistrate Finch, not a priest, who performed the binding, because there was no priest in Greyridge willing to touch Orc custom, and because the accord's language cared only for witnessed intent, not sanctified ceremony. She had Abel cut a shallow line across his palm with his own belt knife, had Bagrak do the same despite her bound wrists, and pressed their palms together before the assembled council so that their blood mixed and dripped onto the packed dirt floor of the hall, sealing, in the eyes of both human law and clan law, a marriage neither of them had chosen for love, only for survival, and yet which set something trembling and unfamiliar loose in Abel's chest all the same when her rough, strong hand closed fully around his for the first time. The days that followed were strange ones. Bagrak Bloodhorn's wrists were unbound by treaty right, though Overseer Hale insisted, not without some justification, that she remain near the stables under Abel's watch rather than roam the camp freely, at least until the camp folk grew used to the idea of an orc walking among them unchained. She did not seem to mind the arrangement. She had, Abel came to learn, a natural affinity for the horses in a way that startled him. She moved among the skittish young geldings with none of his slow, patient coaxing, and instead simply stood still and let them come to her, as though she understood on some deeper level that trust could not be forced, only offered. "You have a way with them," Abel said one morning, watching her run a hand down the flank of a nervous chestnut mare that had thrown 3 riders that week. "I have spent more nights sleeping beside my war-mount than beside any roof," Bagrak said. "Horses do not lie about what they feel. Humans lie constantly. It is restful being near a creature that does not." "Do I lie to you?" She glanced sideways at him, a slow, assessing look that made his pulse trip over itself. "Not yet." She stayed in the loft above the stable, in a space Abel had cleared and lined with furs traded up from the lowland markets, and though the arrangement had begun purely as a matter of law and expedience, he found himself within the first 2 weeks, thinking of her constantly, the low rasp of her voice when she hummed some old clan song while brushing down the horses, the surprising gentleness of her hands despite their strength, the way she had begun, almost without either of them noticing, to save him the choicest cuts of meat from her own plate at the shared camp table, growling at anyone who dared comment on it. Not everyone in Greyridge took kindly to the arrangement. Sergeant Price made no secret of his contempt, calling Abel an orc's pet within earshot more than once, and a knot of the rougher timber hands had taken to muttering about traitors and half-breed sympathizers whenever Bagrak passed through the yard. Abel bore it in silence, the way he had borne most slights in his life, but he noticed that Bagrak did not. The first time a drunken logger named Harmon Diet spat at her feet in the mess yard and called her a mangy beast wearing a woman's shape, Bagrak Bloodhorn crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, seized him by the collar of his shirt, and lifted him half off his feet with one arm. "Say it again," she said, her voice terribly calm, "and I will feed you your own teeth." "Bagrak," Abel said quickly, stepping between them, one hand light on her forearm, not pulling, just present. "He's not worth the trouble, let him be." She looked at Abel, then at Dietz, then set the man down hard enough to knock the wind from him and stepped back. "For you," she said, "not for him." Dietz scrambled away, cursing, and the yard full of watching eyes swung slowly, uncertainly, from Bagrak's furious face to Abel's steady one. And something in that exchange, the sight of a fearsome orc warrior yielding not to threat, but to a quiet request from the man beside her, seemed to unsettle the onlookers more than any show of violence could have. That night in the loft above the stable, Bagrak found him mending a bridle by lantern light and settled across from him without invitation, close enough that her knee brushed his. "You should not step between me and men like that," she said. I could break him without effort. I know you could. That's not the point. If you break every man in this camp who insults you, they'll have Hale hang you regardless of what the accord says, treaty or no treaty. I'd rather you stayed alive and insulted than dead and vindicated." She was quiet a moment, watching his hands work the leather. "You are a strange man, Abel Brooks. You will not aim a bow at me when I am your enemy, and you will not let me defend myself when I am your wife. What is it you want from me?" The question hung there, more raw than either of them had expected. Abel set the bridle aside. "I don't want anything from you that you don't want to give," he said. "I made that claim to save your life, Bagrak." "I never expected," he stopped, searching for words. "I never expected to like having you here, to look forward to you being here. That wasn't part of the bargain, but it's true anyway." Something in her dark eyes softened, the sharp warrior's edge giving way, just for a moment, to something more uncertain, more human, if that word could even apply. "Among my people," she said slowly, "when a claim is made in truth, in desire, and not merely in law, it is marked, a binding beyond words." She reached out, slow enough that he could have pulled away, and traced one rough finger along the healed line on his palm where their blood had mixed weeks before. "I did not think, when I accepted your claim, that I would come to want the marking to be true. And now, Bagrak Bloodhorn said, I find I want a great many things I did not expect to want." She kissed him then, or he kissed her afterward. Neither of them could say for certain who had closed the distance first, only that it happened, sudden and fierce and hungry, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt, his own rising to cup the sharp line of her jaw as though she were something that might vanish if he did not hold on. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had spent weeks circling something neither had dared name, and when it finally broke, both of them were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the lantern light. "That," Bagrak said, low and rough, "was not required by treaty." "No," Abel agreed. "That one was just for us." Word of the growing warmth between the stable boy and his orc wife spread through Greyridge Camp the way all things spread in a small mountain settlement, quickly, and with considerable exaggeration. Some found it scandalous. A few, mostly the older wives and the camp healer Marta, found it quietly touching, evidence that even in a hard border camp, tenderness could take root in unlikely soil. Price found it infuriating, and made no secret of petitioning Overseer Hale to have the claim reviewed and revoked on some technicality, though Magistrate Finch shut down each attempt with the same tired patience she'd shown from the start. It was 2 months into their bond, with autumn turning the high slopes gold and the nights growing sharp with the promise of early snow, that trouble came down from the passes in a form none of them had prepared for. A rider from the eastern watchtower came pounding into camp at dusk, half frozen and wild-eyed, shouting that an orc war party was descending the switchback road, 20 strong, bearing a banner of parley rather than raid, and at their head rode a champion the watchman had heard named in a shouted challenge. Gorham Ashclaw of the Bloodhorn clan's rival house, come to claim back what he said belonged to him. Bagrak went very still when she heard the name. "You know him," Abel said, watching her face. "Gorham Ashclaw was promised to me by my clan's elders before I ever rode out as a scout," Bagrak said. "A political match, made when I was younger to bind 2 feuding houses of the Bloodhorn line. I never accepted it in my heart, though the elders considered it settled. When I did not return from my scouting circuit, when word reached the clan that I had been taken and claimed by a human under the old accord, Gorham would have seen it as an insult to his honor as much as a loss. Is he dangerous? He is a champion of our war bands. He has killed 12 men in single combat and never once been beaten." She met Abel's eyes. "Yes, he is dangerous, and he will not accept that I have chosen otherwise because in his eyes I never had the right to choose at all." Gorham Ashclaw arrived at the camp gates the following dawn, under a banner of pale hide, marked with the accord's parley sigil, which meant Overseer Hale could not turn him away without violating the treaty himself. He was enormous even by orc standards, a mountain of corded muscle scarred from 100 old wounds, his tusks capped with bands of hammered iron, his dark eyes fixing on Bagrak the moment she stepped into the square with a hunger that had nothing to do with tenderness and everything to do with ownership. "Bagrak Bloodhorn," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd of camp folk who had turned out to gawk at the spectacle. "You were promised to me before the elders. I have come to correct the insult of your theft." "I was not stolen, Gorham," Bagrak said, her chin lifted, her hand resting near the hilt of the blade the camp had returned to her weeks ago as a gesture of goodwill. "I yielded, and I claimed under the old law of my own will." "You claimed a human," Gorham said, and the contempt in his voice was a physical thing, a blow aimed at every human standing within earshot as much as at Bagrak herself. "A stable boy who cannot even hold a blade without shaking. This is not a claim, Bloodhorn. This is a woman shaming her clan to avoid the noose, and I will not let that shame stand." It might have ended there with words alone if the crowd had not already been primed for suspicion. It was Sergeant Price, watching the exchange with narrow satisfaction, who raised his voice into the gathering silence and said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, "Ask her how she knew the timber road so well when she was captured, Overseer. Ask her if this whole marriage wasn't a ploy from the start, an orc scout worming her way into our camp under cover of a claim, learning our patrol schedules, waiting for her clan to come finish what she started." The suggestion, baseless as it was, caught like dry tinder in a crowd already frightened by the sight of 20 armed orc warriors camped at their gates. Voices rose. Someone shouted "spy," and the word spread through the square like a struck match. Faces that had grown almost used to Bagrak's presence over the past 2 months twisting suddenly back into fear and old hatred, the fragile trust of 2 months undone in the space of a single accusation. "That's a lie," Abel said, pushing forward through the crowd, but his voice, quiet as it had always been, was lost beneath the rising clamor. Someone threw a stone. It struck Bagrak's shoulder, and though it did little more than bruise, the crowd's mood shifted at the sight of blood that wasn't. A strange, dark thrill running through the gathered camp, folk the way it does through any mob that has found a target and permission all at once. More stones followed. Someone produced a length of rope. Someone else shouted for the sergeant to finish what should have been done on the ridge months ago. And Bagrak, who could have cut down a dozen men without breaking a sweat, stood frozen at the center of it, not out of fear for herself, but out of the terrible understanding that any violence from her now would be the proof they wanted, the excuse they were praying for. Abel Brooks shoved through the last of the crowd and put himself directly between Bagrak and the mob, arms spread, his own body the only shield he had to offer. "Stop," he shouted, and something in the raw desperation of his voice cut through the noise where reason had failed. "Stop it. She's done nothing. I claimed her under our own law before this whole council, and not one of you said a word against it until Gorham Ashclaw showed up at our gates with 20 spears. You want to talk about who's serving whose interests, look at who's shouting loudest." "Get out of the way, boy," someone shouted from the crowd. "This isn't your fight." "She's my wife," Abel said, and his voice did not shake, though every part of him was shaking. "That makes it exactly my fight. You want to stone her, you go through me first." A stone struck his shoulder instead of hers, thrown by someone in the crowd too far gone in fear to care who it hit, and he did not move. Another grazed his temple, and still he did not move, standing with his arms spread and his body between the mob and the woman he had claimed. And it was that, not his words, not the treaty, not even the shouting magistrate Finch was now doing as she forced her way through the crowd with 2 of Hale's guards behind her, that finally broke the mob's fever. Because a crowd can convince itself of many things about a monster. It has a much harder time stoning a man who will not stop bleeding to protect one. "Enough!" Magistrate Finch's voice cracked across the square like a whip. "Enough, all of you. Anyone who throws another stone answers to me for breaking the Accord's peace, and I will see you in the stocks before the week is out. This woman is bound under treaty law, claimed and witnessed before this very council, and I will not stand here and watch you make liars of us all." The crowd's fury, deprived of its momentum, began to falter and fold in on itself. Uncertain faces looking at the blood on Abel's temple, at Bagrak standing rigid and silent behind him, at the 20 armed orc warriors still watching from the gate with expressions that had shifted subtly, from contempt to something more complicated. It was Gorham Ashclaw who broke the silence, and what he said surprised everyone, Bagrak most of all. "This human stood before a mob to shield her," Gorham said slowly, "with nothing in his hands but empty air when he might have run. That is not the act of a spy's accomplice, nor of a coward." He looked at Abel with something that was not quite respect but was no longer pure contempt either. "You have courage, stable boy, foolish courage, but courage." "I'm not looking for your approval," Abel said, wiping blood from his temple with the back of his hand. "No," Gorham agreed. "You are looking to keep what is mine." His dark eyes went to Bagrak. "This is not finished, Bloodhorn. I will not leave this valley and tell the elders I allowed a human claim to stand unchallenged. There is a right older than your treaty claim, the challenge right. If this human will fight me for you, blade to blade, and win, I will withdraw my claim before all our people, and the elders will have no grounds to dispute your bond. If he loses, you return with me, treaty or no treaty, and this camp will learn the cost of defying 20 spears at their gate." The square went utterly silent. "That's madness," Overseer Hale said. "You can't ask a stable hand to duel a war champion who's killed 12 men. "Then the human forfeits and she comes with me regardless," Gorham said simply. "Those are his only choices, fight or lose her anyway." All eyes turned to Abel Brooks. He looked at Bagrak and she looked back at him, and in her dark eyes he saw something he had never seen there before, real fear, not for herself but for him. "Don't," she said, low, urgent, for his ears alone. "Abel, he will kill you. This is not a fight you can win. Let me go and fight in your place. Our law allows for a champion to stand for—" "No," Abel said. "Abel, I'm not going to hide behind you again, Bagrak. Not on this." He turned back to Gorham Ashclaw. "I'll fight you. Tomorrow at dawn, on neutral ground, blade to blade, by whatever rules your people hold to." "Abel Brooks," Bagrak said, and there was real anguish in it now, stripped of all warrior's composure, "you have never held a blade in true combat in your life." "No," he agreed quietly, so only she could hear. "But I've stood in front of 6 bows for you once already, and I'd do it again. I'm not going to let him drag you off this mountain while I watch and do nothing. If I lose trying. That has to count for something." She stared at him, and something in her fierce, guarded heart broke open entirely, right there in the square, in front of the whole watching camp. "Then I will teach you what I can tonight," she said, her voice rough. "Every hour we have left before dawn, I will spend making sure you at least have a chance." They spent that whole night in the stable yard by torchlight, Bagrak drilling him relentlessly on footwork and guard positions, on the small, ugly tricks that kept a smaller fighter alive against a larger one, her patience fraying only when fear for him overtook her frustration at how little time they had. Abel's arms ached, his knuckles split, his breath came ragged, and still she pushed him, because the alternative was watching him die at dawn with nothing to offer against Gorham Ashclaw's 12-kill blade but raw courage alone. "You cannot match his strength," Bagrak said near midnight, both of them sweating despite the cold, her hands guiding his grip on the borrowed sword for the 100th time. "You must survive his strength and wait for the opening his pride will give him. He is arrogant. He will try to end this quickly to humiliate you before the crowd. Let him overreach. That is your only chance. And if there isn't an opening—" She stopped and reached up to touch the bruised, split skin at his temple where the stone had struck him that afternoon, her rough thumb impossibly gentle. "Then I lose the only man who has ever chosen me freely, without treaty, without law, simply because he wanted to." Her voice broke on the last word. "I did not expect to love you, Abel Brooks. I accepted your claim to save my life, and I did not expect that within 2 seasons I would rather lose my own life than yours. But here I am. Bagrak, I love you, she said, fierce and raw, as though saying it plainly might somehow armor him against the dawn. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that. I have never said those words to any living thing before you. He kissed her then, in the torchlit stable yard, with his hands still raw from the night's drilling, and for a long moment neither of them thought about Gorham Ashclaw or the dawn or the treaty at all, only about each other, about the strange, unlikely, hard-won thing that had grown between a stable hand and a scout across 2 seasons of shared meals and shared fear. Dawn came gray and cold over the ridge above Greyridge Camp, the same ridge where 6 bows had once been aimed at a wounded woman, and one had refused to rise. The whole camp turned out to watch, along with Gorham Ashclaw's 20 warriors, forming a rough circle in the trampled snow at the field's edge. Gorham stripped to the waist despite the cold, showing a body carved from decades of war, and hefted a blade twice the weight of the one Abel carried. Abel Brooks, pale, unshaven, his arms still aching from the night's drilling, stepped into the circle across from him and found Bagrak's eyes across the crowd, holding them for one long breath before the fight began. It was, from the first exchange, exactly as brutal as everyone had feared. Gorham's first strike nearly took Abel's head off, and only the desperate, half-remembered footwork Bagrak had drilled into him through the night let him twist aside in time, the blade whistling past close enough to stir his hair. He staggered, caught his balance, and Gorham grinned, certain, contemptuous, already savoring the ease of what he expected to be a brief and humiliating slaughter. Abel did not try to match him blow for blow. He could not have, and he knew it. Instead, he moved the way Bagrak had taught him, giving ground when he had to, letting Gorham's massive strikes carry the champion's weight past its center again and again, refusing every invitation to a contest of raw strength, absorbing glancing blows on his forearms that left him bruised and bleeding but alive, buying himself seconds, and then minutes, in a fight everyone had expected to end in heartbeats. The crowd's jeering slowly gave way to something else, a tense, disbelieving murmur as the stable boy kept getting back up, kept finding his feet, kept surviving what should have killed him 3 times over. Gorham's patience, as Bagrak had predicted, began to fray. His strikes grew wilder, angrier, less controlled, humiliation creeping into his rage at his failure to end this quickly before his own watching warriors. And on one such strike, overreaching, off balance, his blade buried a fraction too deep into the packed snow where Abel had rolled clear. Abel saw the opening Bagrak had promised him would come. He drove forward and opened a shallow gash across Gorham's exposed forearm, not deep enough to be crippling, but enough to draw blood enough to prove, before the whole assembled crowd of both peoples, that the stable boy could land a blow at all. It was not enough to win the fight outright. Gorham, roaring now with fury and humiliation both, abandoned all restraint and closed the distance in one final, murderous lunge aimed not to wound but to end things. A blow meant to cleave through Abel's guard entirely. A killing strike that Abel, exhausted, bleeding, his arms failing beneath him, had no strength left to fully turn aside. Bagrak Bloodhorn moved before any of the watching crowd had time to draw breath. She crossed the space between the ring's edge and the fight's center faster than anyone believed an orc her size could move, and threw herself between Gorham's descending blade and the man she had claimed, taking the strike across her own shoulder and side instead of letting it reach him. The blow that would have killed Abel Brooks outright tore instead through leather and flesh at her ribs, and she cried out, the first sound of true pain anyone in Greyridge Camp had ever heard her make, and went down hard into the trampled snow, blood spreading dark and fast beneath her. The whole field erupted into chaos. Gorham stood frozen, his blade still raised, staring down at the woman he had once been promised to, who now lay bleeding in the snow because she had chosen, without hesitation, to place her own body between a killing blow and a human man. Bagrak. Abel dropped his sword entirely and fell to his knees beside her, hands pressing frantically against the wound at her side, blood welling hot between his fingers. "No, no, stay with me, stay with me. I told you," she rasped, her voice thin with pain but her dark eyes still fierce, still fixed on him. "I would rather lose my own life than yours." Gorham Ashclaw's warriors murmured amongst themselves in low, urgent Orc dialect, and it was one of the eldest among them, a gray-tusked warrior who had clearly witnessed such things before, who finally stepped forward and spoke, first in Orc and then, seeing the human crowd's confusion, in halting common tongue. "She has broken the challenge right," the elder said, "by intervening between the champion and his opponent. Among our law, this act forfeits her right to challenge claim by Gorham's house forever. She is cast out from consideration of that bond, but more than that, by shedding her own blood to shield a human under threat of duel, she has renounced her clan's right to reclaim her at all. She is exiled from the protection of Bloodhorn's elders. She belongs now only to whatever bond she chose with her own body in her own blood." The old warrior looked at Gorham. "Your claim is void, champion, not because you lost the duel. Because she never let it finish, and in doing so, she gave you your answer more clearly than any blade could." Gorham Ashclaw stood very still for a long moment, looking down at Bagrak Bloodhorn bleeding in the snow with her hand locked around Abel Brooks's wrist, and something in his proud, scarred face finally, grudgingly, gave way to something like acceptance. "So be it," he said heavily. "The elders will hear of this. I will not contest what she has chosen with her own blood. But know this, Bloodhorn, you walk without clan now. No Bloodhorn banner will shelter you again. You have made yourself an exile for this human." "I know," Bagrak said, her voice a thread of pain but utterly without regret. "I would do it again." They carried her to old Marta's healing house on a litter of spear hafts and canvas, the same makeshift construction that had once carried her wounded into this very camp as a prisoner. And this time, it was not only Abel who walked beside her but half the camp, murmuring, uncertain, watching the woman who had thrown herself into a killing blow to save the man who had refused to kill her. The wound was deep but had missed anything vital by the width of 2 fingers, Marta pronounced grimly, working through the night by lantern light to clean and stitch the gash while Abel held Bagrak's hand and refused to leave her side, ignoring his own untreated bruises entirely. Fever took her for 2 days afterward, her big frame shivering under every blanket the camp could spare, her words during the worst of it slipping between common tongue and her native dialect, fragments of old clan songs and half-remembered childhood mixed with Abel's name, over and over, like an anchor she was gripping to keep herself from drifting too far. He did not sleep those 2 days. He sat beside her cot in Marta's healing house, changing the dressing on her wound, pressing cool cloths to her fever-flushed skin, talking to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, the horses in the stable, the weather on the ridge. The first time he had seen her lower her blade, because some instinct told him that even lost in fever, some part of her could still hear him and needed to know he was there. On the 3rd morning her fever broke and she woke to find him slumped exhausted in the chair beside her cot, his hand still wrapped around hers. "Abel," she rasped. He startled awake instantly. "Bagrak, you're awake. Thank every star in the sky you're awake." His voice cracked with the force of 2 sleepless days finally catching up to him. "How do you feel?" "Like I took a champion's blade meant for a fool who would not aim his bow at me," she said, and though her voice was weak, there was warmth in it, dry humor threading through the pain. "You are still here. Where else would I be? You could have run that day on the ridge. You could have loosed your arrow and gone home to your stables and never thought of me again." Her thumb moved weakly against his palm, over the old scar of their first binding. "Instead, I find myself here, exiled from my own clan, bleeding in a human healing house, and somehow it does not feel like loss." "It's not," Abel said, pressing his forehead gently to the back of her hand. I know what it cost you. I know your clan, your name, everything you were, and I know you gave it up to save me, and I don't have any way to repay that except to tell you I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever. Whatever's left of your life, I want to be part of it, if you'll have me, not because of treaty law, not because a magistrate cut our palms open 2 seasons ago, but because I love you, Bagrak Bloodhorn. I think I've loved you since the moment you lowered that blade on the ridge, and I realized you weren't what 6 terrified recruits thought you were. Tears, unfamiliar and unashamed, slid from the corners of her dark eyes. I have no clan left to call my own, she said. No banner, no elders, no house. Only this valley and these strange humans who half of them still fear me and you. Then let this valley be your clan, Abel said. Let me be your house. I know it's not what you were born to. I know it's smaller than what you lost. But it's yours if you want it for as long as I've got breath in me to offer it. She drew him down, careful of her wound, and kissed him, slow and certain this time, without the desperation of the night before the duel. A kiss that felt like a door closing on one life and opening onto another. Greyridge Camp changed, in the weeks that followed, in ways no one could have predicted 3 months earlier. The sight of Bagrak Bloodhorn's blood in the snow, given freely to save a human she had no legal obligation left to protect, did more to soften the camp's fear of her than any treaty clause ever could have. Sergeant Price, stripped of his rank by Magistrate Finch for inciting the mob in the square, left Greyridge within the month to seek his fortune elsewhere, and few mourned his absence. Overseer Hale, gruff as ever, nonetheless found himself, some weeks later, quietly assigning Bagrak paid work training the camp's war horses and pack mules alongside Abel, work she took to with a fierce, focused joy that surprised even her. Old Marta took to calling her the Bloodhorn Girl with an unmistakable note of fondness, and even Harmon Dietz, the drunk logger who had once spat at her feet, found himself, in a fit of shamed gratitude after his own daughter was thrown from a spooked mule and caught mid-fall by Bagrak's quick reflexes, muttering something that might charitably have been called an apology. Abel and Bagrak took over a small cabin at the stable's edge, built with the help of the camp's carpenters as a wedding gift, of sorts, though neither of them had ever had a formal wedding beyond the blood binding in the timber hall. Bagrak insisted, once she was fully healed, on one addition to that old law-bound claim, a private rite of her own people's making, performed at dusk on the ridge where they had first met. Just the two of them, no council, no witnesses but the mountain and the darkening sky. She cut a lock of her own dark hair and one of his, bound them together with a leather cord, and pressed the small braid into his palm. "This is not law," she told him, her voice steady and sure in a way it had not been the day of their first binding. "This is only truth. I choose you, Abel Brooks, not because a treaty demanded it, not because my life depended on it. I choose you because you are the only man who ever looked at me and saw something worth not killing, and then spent every day after proving he meant it." "I choose you too," Abel said, closing his fingers around the small braid of their hair. "For exactly as long as you'll let me." "Forever then," Bagrak said, "if forever is what you are offering." "Forever," Abel agreed. Winter came hard to the Thornwood Range that year, burying the camp in snow for weeks at a stretch. But the little cabin at the stable's edge stayed warm, wood smoke curling up from its chimney alongside a dozen others, indistinguishable now from any other home in Greyridge. Bagrak Bloodhorn, exile of her clan, wife of a stable hand, sat many evenings by that fire with her boots off and her braided hair loose, watching able men tack by lantern light, and found that the ache of what she had lost, her clan, her name, the house of Bloodhorn that would never claim her again, had not vanished, but had settled into something bearable, cradled alongside the fierce, quiet joy of what she had chosen instead. She would never again ride beneath her clan's banner, never again sit among the elders who had raised her, and some nights that loss still caught in her throat unexpectedly, sharp as the first cut of a blade. But she had a home now that no war party could burn and no treaty could undo, built not on law or fear, but on a man who had refused, on a cold ridge on an ordinary patrol, to raise his bow against a wounded stranger, and had gone on refusing every day since to let her carry anything alone that he could help her carry instead. "Do you regret it?" Abel asked her once, deep in that first winter, watching her stare into the fire with that faraway look she sometimes got when she thought of the mountains beyond the valley, the clan fires she would never sit beside again. Bagrak considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, and then reached across the space between them and took his scarred hand in hers, tracing the old thin line across his palm where their blood had first mixed in the timber hall so long ago. "No," she said, and meant it completely. "I traded a clan for a home, Abel Brooks. I traded a name I did not choose for a man who chose me freely every single day, even before he had any reason left to. That is not a loss. That is the best trade I have ever made." Outside, the snow kept falling over Grayridge Camp, soft and steady, burying the ridge where a bow had once been lowered and a blade had once yielded first. But inside the little cabin at the stable's edge, the fire burned warm and bright, and neither of them was ever from that night forward alone again.